Amid the colonial Lima of the 16th century, one of the brightest examples of humility and charity the Catholic Church has ever known, was born. Saint Martin de Porres. His birth took place on December 9, 1579, in a context marked by social inequality, Spanish rule, and a rigid racial hierarchy. The son of a Spanish nobleman, Don Juan de Porres, and a freed black woman, Ana Velázquez, Martin came into the world under the weight of discrimination and prejudice. At that time, children of interracial unions were considered inferior, and many were relegated to poverty and abandonment. Yet God had already traced for that boy a grand destiny, hidden under the veil of simplicity. From childhood, Martin showed an uncommon sensitivity for spiritual things. While other children were distracted in the streets of Lima, he withdrew in prayer or sought to help his mother with household chores, always with a smile on his face and words of comfort for those in need. There was in him a serenity that seemed not to belong to this world, a calm that reflected the presence of God. His mother, a woman of deep faith, passed on to him the love for Christ and for the Blessed Virgin, cultivating in little Martin the habit of praying the rosary and of helping the poor, even with the few resources they possessed. Martin grew up marked by a double reality. On the one hand, the social disdain that fell upon him for being mulatto. On the other, the love and compassion that the Holy Spirit made spring in his heart. This tension shaped his soul and taught him to see in every human being the face of the suffering Christ. Rather than rebel against injustice, he transformed it into an opportunity for sanctification. He often said that love knows neither color nor condition, and his actions showed that he believed this with all his heart. The suffering the world imposed on him became for him a school of virtues. As the years passed, Martin began to work as an apprentice barber and nurse. In colonial Lima, these trades involved not only cutting hair or treating wounds, but also caring for the sick and applying herbal remedies. He dedicated himself with extreme gentleness and compassion to the ill, tending both rich and poor, but always giving preference to those who had nothing with which to pay. Many saw him as a simple servant, but those who knew him more closely perceived something different. Martin had a gift, an inner light that attracted and consoled souls. His religious vocation began to dawn early. Martin felt an irresistible call to serve God totally. He dreamed of entering a religious order, but he knew that his color and origin would be almost insurmountable obstacles. At that time, religious orders often refused candidates who were not white or of noble origin. Even so, Martin did not despair. On the contrary, he intensified his prayers and placed his life in the hands of divine providence, confident that the Lord would open the way at the right time. At 15, with his heart inflamed with love for Christ, Martin went to the Dominican convent in Lima and asked to be received as a helper, a simple servant. He was accepted as an oblate, that is, someone who served the community voluntarily without formally belonging to the order. His tasks were humble, sweeping the corridors, tending the garden, helping in the infirmary, and attending to the poor who knocked at the convent door. But Martin saw all that as an altar, where he could offer each gesture, each drop of sweat, as a sacrifice of love to God. His humility delighted the friars. Soon the Dominicans began to perceive that there was something extraordinary in that young man. Despite performing the simplest works, Martin exuded a contagious joy and a deep peace. It was common to see him recollected in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, immersed in contemplation. Some brothers testified that at certain moments he seemed to levitate during prayer, a sign of the intimate union between his soul and God. Martin, however, fled from any praise, always saying, "I am only a poor servant of the Lord." The fame of his holiness began to spread throughout Lima. The poor sought him out for remedies and counsel, the rich for peace and spiritual direction. He attended to all with the same sweetness, treating each person as if he were Christ himself. One of his greatest gifts was that of reconciling hearts. Many enemies began to speak again, thanks to his silent intervention, made of prayer and tenderness. Martin understood that the true miracle lies not only in the healing of the body, but above all, in the healing of the soul. Besides his love for people, Martin had a special fondness for animals. He saw in all creatures the reflection of divine goodness. He fed cats, dogs, and even rats, treating them with the same respect with which he treated people. It is said that one day, seeing the convent infested with rats, he gently asked them to withdraw to the garden, promising to feed them there daily. And surprisingly, the animals obeyed. This episode became a symbol of his purity and his communion with creation. For Martin, each day was an opportunity to serve. He never complained of fatigue, humiliations, or heavy tasks. He offered everything to God as a form of penance and love. He slept little, ate only what was necessary, and dedicated his nights to prayer. Many times he spent hours before the crucifix, contemplating the sufferings of Christ and asking for strength to imitate him. His life, though simple in the eyes of the world, was a silent hymn of love, a living preaching of the gospel in gestures and attitudes. The first part of the life of St. Martin de Porres is therefore the portrait of a soul that learned from early on to transform pain into holiness and poverty into spiritual wealth. He teaches us that there is no human barrier capable of preventing the divine call, and that true nobility lies in humility. His humble birth, his difficulties, and his fidelity to God prepared the ground so that the mulatto boy from Lima would one day become the first black saint of the Americas and one of the greatest examples of charity in the history of the Church. In the convent of Our Lady of the Rosary of the Dominicans of Lima, Martin de Porres lived years of intense dedication, silence, and service. His day began before dawn, with prayers and meditation, followed by work in the corridors, the cells, and the infirmary. Nothing escaped his attentive eye. He cleaned the floors with care, took care of the friar's clothes, and prepared medicines for the sick with almost miraculous precision. But what impressed the most was the serenity with which he did everything. Each movement seemed a prayer, and each task, however simple, was transformed into an act of love for God. Many friars testified that upon crossing paths with Martin, they felt an inexplicable peace, as if they were in the presence of a man who already lived in constant communion with heaven. Supernatural gifts began to manifest even while he was a simple lay brother helper. Some monks, visiting the infirmary at night, saw Martin enveloped in a soft light, bent over the sick, praying silently. Others saw him in two places at the same time. While he was tending a sick person, someone swore to have seen him in the chapel in deep adoration. These episodes, although extraordinary, did not cause in Martin any pride. On the contrary, he hid his gifts with humility, saying that everything was the work of divine mercy. "I am only the instrument. It is God who acts," he repeated always, fleeing any human recognition. One of the first miracles attributed to him occurred when an epidemic spread through Lima. The convent was filled with sick people, and medical resources were scarce. Martin, moved by compassion, cared for everyone without rest. He cleaned purulent wounds, consoled the dying, and distributed the few remedies he had. One night, the prior of the convent, seeing him exhausted, ordered him not to enter the cloister reserved for sick religious anymore, for fear of contagion. Martin obeyed, but upon hearing the groans of a dying friar, he could not resist. He jumped the wall and went to aid him. When the prior reprimanded him, he replied serenely, "Forgive me, my father, but I did not know that obedience had priority over charity." That answer, spoken with sweetness and without arrogance, disarmed the superior, who blessed him and never again imposed restrictions on him. Another event that moved the friars was the episode in which Martin found a poor Indian gravely wounded on the street. He took him to the convent and prepared a bed for him, cleaning his wounds and feeding him with his own hands. The prior, upon discovering it, told him that it was not permitted to bring strangers inside the convent. Martin, with a serene voice, replied, "Forgive me, my father, but I thought the convent was God's house and that the poor man is his most important guest." From then on, he was allowed to receive all the needy, transforming the convent into a true refuge of mercy. The poor, orphans, and the sick found in Martin not only a nurse, but a friend, a brother, and above all, a living reflection of the love of Christ. Besides caring for bodies, Martin also healed souls. Many approached him tormented by sin, guilt, and fear of condemnation. He listened to them patiently, counseled them with tenderness, and led them to confession and prayer. His gaze penetrated people's souls, but he never judged. On the contrary, he made them feel loved and worthy of divine forgiveness. This ability to see the interior suffering of others caused many to return to the faith and to sacramental life. It was common to hear in Lima that whoever speaks with Martin returns to smile. Such was his spiritual influence on all who knew him. Once, a rich merchant, afflicted by a fever that no doctor could cure, asked Martin to visit him. He entered the room, made the sign of the cross over the sick man, and placed his hand on his forehead, praying in silence. In a few minutes, the man began to sweat, and upon awakening, felt completely healed. The merchant, overcome with gratitude, wanted to reward him with a large sum of money, but Martin refused, saying, "Charity has no price, and the love of God cannot be bought." Indeed, the news of the cure spread quickly, and many began to seek the humble brother not only for his herbal remedies, but for the faith that emanated from his presence. The friars began to witness inexplicable phenomena around Martin. Locked doors opened when he needed to help someone. Incurable wounds healed after his prayers, and even food seemed to multiply in his hands when poverty afflicted the convent. On one occasion, there was no more bread to feed the beggars who waited at the door. Martin gathered the crumbs that remained, made the sign of the cross, and began to distribute them. Miraculously, everyone ate, and there was still some left. This fact was considered a clear sign of the divine presence acting through his humility. Despite his gifts, Martin never sought recognition. When someone called him saint, he bowed his head and said, "Saint is the one who does the will of God in everything, and I am still learning." He lived in a continuous state of interior prayer, transforming even the hardest work into praise. At night, he withdrew to the chapel, where he spent long hours before the Blessed Sacrament, often in ecstasy. Some brothers claimed to have seen angels around him, singing heavenly hymns while he prayed. Martin, however, never commented on these facts, preferring to remain hidden in the humility of daily service. As time passed, his fame crossed the walls of the convent and reached even the viceroyalty of Peru. People of all social classes came seeking him, from African slaves to Spanish nobles. He attended to all with the same love, without distinction. For Martin, each person was a soul redeemed by the blood of Christ, and the dignity of a beggar was equal to that of a king before God. This concrete witness of Christian fraternity caused admiration even among non-believers, who saw in him living proof that holiness is possible even in the most humble conditions. Martin's presence in the convent was like a balm. When there were tensions or disagreements among the friars, his silent presence was enough for peace to return. He had the gift of reconciliation, the fruit of the deep charity that sprang from his heart. One day, seeing two brothers arguing, he approached and simply placed his hands on both their shoulders, saying, "My brothers, remember that we are all children of the same Father. What sense is there in fighting over things that time will take away?" Those words, spoken with gentleness, dissolved the anger and left only tears of repentance. Thus, Martin made the convent a mirror of divine charity. The conventual life of Saint Martin de Porres was marked by small great miracles, healings, multiplications, reconciliations, but above all by the interior transformation of souls who approached him. His holiness did not lie only in the wonders he performed, but in the way he loved, served, and forgave. He embodied the Beatitudes of Christ, showing that true greatness lies in humility and that the path to heaven is made with steps of silent charity. His life became, little by little, a flame that illuminated all of Lima and prepared the world to recognize in him a saint who would transcend races and borders. The fame of sanctity of Martin de Porres spread quickly throughout the city of Lima, crossing walls, convents, and palaces. People saw him in the streets, humbly dressed in the simple Dominican habit, carrying baskets of food, medicines, and clothing for the needy. There was no misery he did not try to relieve, nor human pain that went unnoticed by his compassionate eyes. Martin used to say that charity is the medicine of souls and bodies, and he saw in service to his neighbor the purest form of worship to God. For him, caring for the poor was like touching Christ himself in his suffering, and this transformed each act of compassion into a living prayer. During the years he worked in the convent infirmary, Martin became known as the Father of the Poor. His compassion knew no limits, and his dedication seemed superhuman. He spent entire days without resting, caring for terminally ill patients, feeding abandoned children, and aiding slaves wounded by the cruel punishments of their masters. He washed their wounds, wept with them, and at the same time spoke to them of the love of God, reminding them that, despite human injustices, heaven awaited them with tenderness. Many who had lost the faith returned to believe, not because of theological words, but because of the concrete mercy they saw in his hands and in his gaze. One of the best-known episodes of his life happened when an epidemic of plague struck Lima, and the convent was transformed into an improvised hospital. The friars and nurses fell ill one after another, and panic began to spread. Martin, fearing neither death nor contagion, cared for everyone, cleaning wounds, feeding the sick, and preparing herbal remedies. It is said that when resources ran out, he made the sign of the cross over an empty cask of wine used for the sick, and the cask filled again, enough to satisfy all the patients. The friars, with tears in their eyes, recognized in that miracle the love of God manifested through a faithful and silent servant. Martin's charity, however, went beyond visible miracles. He possessed a singular capacity for consolation. Many times the poor came to him not to seek remedies, but words of hope. And he received them with the same respect one would have before a king. He sat beside them, listened to their sorrows, and said, "God loves you as if you were the only one in the world. He sees you, even when the world ignores you." These words, simple and full of faith, were like balm for weary hearts. Martin knew that charity is not summed up in giving things, but in giving oneself completely, with the heart. Among the many reported miracles, there is one that especially moves. One day, a poor man arrived at the convent door with a gangrenous wound on his leg, already about to be amputated. Martin knelt, carefully cleaned the wound, and said a brief prayer. When he removed the cloth, the wound was completely healed. The man, overcome with astonishment, began to cry, and Martin only smiled, saying, "Give thanks to God, for it is He who heals." After this, the man began to help Martin care for other poor people, becoming one of his faithful collaborators. Thus, Martin's charity not only healed, but also transformed hearts. Another admirable event occurred when an orphan boy, afflicted by a high fever, was taken to the convent infirmary. The doctors had already given up, but Martin placed the child in his own bed and spent the night at his side, in prayer. In the morning, the boy was completely recovered and smiling. When the friars asked how this was possible, Martin replied, "The love of God is stronger than any illness." The humility with which he spoke these words showed that for him, miracles were only a means of glorifying God and comforting the afflicted, never a reason for vanity or prominence. His charity also extended to African slaves, who were brought on ships and sold as merchandise in Lima's squares. Martin, who also had African blood, saw in them brothers of soul and treated them with special tenderness. He visited them in the slave quarters, brought them food and cared for their wounds. Many converted to the Catholic faith thanks to his example. A slave witness to his goodness once said, "Martin does not speak of God with words, he speaks with his hands." Indeed, this phrase perfectly sums up the way he evangelized, with actions moved by love and compassion. People began to realize that Martin not only helped the needy, but seemed to anticipate their pains. He knew when someone was suffering, even without that person seeking him out. On more than one occasion, he was seen knocking on the door of a poor person at exactly the moment he was most needed. Some said he had the gift of bilocation, for he was seen at the same time in different places, consoling a dying man and simultaneously praying in the chapel. For Martin, however, there was no mystery in this. He said that love runs faster than the body, and that when one truly loves, God himself leads the heart where it is needed. Even amid so many prodigies, Martin never strayed from simplicity. He continued sweeping the convent corridors, washing the dishes, tending the gardens, and caring for the animals. He considered himself the servant of all, the most unworthy of God's children. When someone praised him, he averted his gaze and replied, "If there is any goodness in me, it is because God placed it there. I have nothing of my own." His humility was so profound that even when sought out by authorities and bishops, he behaved with the same naturalness as always, without changing his gentle and serene tone. The life of Saint Martin de Porres is proof that charity is the most powerful of miracles. His gestures of love transformed not only sick bodies, but souls hardened by suffering. He united poor and rich, white and black, religious and lay, around the truth of the gospel. His life radiated the message of Christ, who washes the disciples' feet and makes himself the servant of all. In Lima, his presence became a symbol of hope and mercy, and his fame crossed borders, reaching even Europe, where missionaries recounted the wonders performed by the mulatto saint of Peru. The soul of Saint Martin de Porres was a true sanctuary inhabited by God. From his earliest years in the convent, he demonstrated a deep interior life, guided by constant prayer and silent contemplation. His heart burned with love for the Eucharist, and he spent hours before the Blessed Sacrament, often kneeling until dawn. There, in adoration, he forgot time, sleep, and the needs of the body. His communion with Christ was so intimate that the friars said they felt upon approaching the chapel a gentle fragrance and an indescribable peace, signs that the Lord truly manifested himself in the soul of that humble servant. Martin had a burning devotion to the Passion of Christ. Before the crucifix, he meditated with tears on the sufferings of the Savior and said that each drop of Jesus' blood was an infinite proof of love for humanity. In his prayers, he incessantly asked for the grace to share in the Lord's pains, not out of mystical vanity, but out of love and compassion. At times, he was seen with his face bathed in tears and his hands pressed to his chest in deep contemplation. Once, a friar who entered the chapel during the night found him suspended in the air, his gaze fixed on the crucifix and surrounded by an intense light. When the friar fell to his knees, Martin only said, "Rise, my brother." He who loves does not need to see miracles in order to believe. His spirituality was not based on extraordinary experiences, but on a constant and silent union with God. He saw the Lord in everything, in the sunrise, in the faces of the poor, in the flowers of the garden, and even in the humblest tasks. For him, the spiritual life was not separate from daily life, but intertwined with every act of love. He often said, if God is present on the altar, he is also present in the floor we sweep with love. This mystical and practical vision of faith made Martin a perfect example of embodied holiness, the kind that does not exalt itself, but hides itself in service and humility. Among his many mystical experiences, there are reports of bilocations, levitations, and apparitions of angels. Several brothers testified to seeing him praying in one place and at the same time caring for the sick elsewhere. Others claimed that when he prayed the rosary, a light emanated from his hands. But Martin himself avoided any conversation about this. When someone questioned him, he replied, "God works wonders to touch hearts, not to magnify the servant." His greatest concern was that such gifts might distance him from humility. Therefore, he did penance with fasts and mortifications, asking God to keep him small and hidden. One of the most beautiful manifestations of his spirituality was his love for the Most Holy Virgin Mary. Martin called her "my mother and lady," and he turned to her in every moment of affliction. He prayed the rosary daily and invited the poor to pray it as well, affirming that whoever clings to the mother's mantle will never be lost. It is said that on certain nights, the friars heard soft hymns coming from his cell, and peering through the crack, saw him kneeling before an image of the Virgin, his face radiant with light, as if in conversation with her. For Martin, Mary was the model of perfect obedience and purity, and his filial love for the Mother of God made him even more docile to the Holy Spirit. In his life of prayer, Martin also had visions of purgatory. He saw the souls who suffered as they awaited final purification and offered for them sacrifices, fasts, and penances. Many times he spent entire nights prostrate on the cold floor, asking God to free the most forgotten souls. He said tenderly, "They suffer because they love and hope. What right do I have to rest while my brothers await heaven?" His love for the souls in purgatory was so great that many called him Apostle of the Suffering Souls. The Church later recognized that his devotion for these souls was a perfect reflection of Christian charity, which transcends time and death. Martin also experienced moments of ecstasy during Mass. When the bell rang calling for the celebration, he left everything he was doing and ran to the chapel. During the consecration, his eyes filled with tears and his soul seemed to be lifted to heaven. The friars said that at certain moments he remained motionless, in such deep adoration that he seemed not to breathe. When asked what he felt, he answered, "At that moment, heaven descends to earth, and the heart cannot bear such tenderness." Indeed, his faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist was absolute, and this love impelled him to love the poor more intensely, seeing in them the same Jesus present on the altar. Despite his supernatural experiences, Martin never departed from obedience and simplicity. When the friars began to call him saint, he firmly reproved them. "Do not call me that. A saint is one who does the will of God to the end." For him, holiness was not found in miracles, but in daily fidelity, in patience with the defects of others, and in persevering love. This vision kept him free from all vanity and made him grow in true spiritual wisdom. His interior life, although full of extraordinary gifts, was sustained by humility, purity of heart, and total trust in divine providence. Angels were his frequent companions. Many witnessed that as he walked through the infirmaries at night, a light accompanied him and an inexplicable fragrance filled the air. Martin said that angels are the silent servants of mercy, and he invoked them to protect the sick and console the afflicted. Once, during a storm that threatened to destroy part of the convent, the friars saw him praying at the window, asking the angels to intercede. Suddenly, the wind ceased and the storm calmed. For him, everything was grace, and each event of life, even trials, was an opportunity to praise God and trust more deeply in His love. As the years passed, Martin plunged ever more deeply into the mystical life without ever abandoning active service. His soul seemed to live between heaven and earth. There was in him a perfect harmony between contemplation and action, between prayer and work. This union of interior life and exterior charity made him a luminous example of the Dominican ideal, to contemplate and to hand on to others what has been contemplated. Thus, Martin became a mirror of divine love, a channel of grace, and a living testimony that true holiness blossoms when the heart is totally surrendered to God and to neighbor. The last years of the life of Saint Martin de Porres were marked by a serenity that only the saints experience. Even aged and tired from long journeys of service and prayer, his countenance remained serene and luminous. It was as if time had no power over that heart completely united to God. He continued caring for the poor, visiting the sick, and serving the friars with the same zeal of his youth. He never complained of the pains that began to afflict his body. On the contrary, he said that illnesses were flowers that God places on the path of those who love Him, so that they may purify themselves more deeply. His health, however, began to visibly decline, and everyone sensed that the earthly end of that faithful servant was approaching. Even ill, Martin did not withdraw from service. When he no longer had strength to walk, he was seen leaning on a cane, still trying to visit the sick of the convent. The infirmary, which had previously been the place where he cured so many, became his own field of suffering. There, lying on a simple bed, he continued to smile and to bless those who visited him. The friars, moved, came to ask for his prayers and counsel, and many left his cell in tears, saying that they felt the presence of God in that small room. Martin said sweetly, "If I can no longer serve with my hands, I now serve with my heart in prayer." God does not ask for strength, He asks for love. During his last weeks, Martin was afflicted by a constant fever and intense pains. Even so, he never complained. He spent the time praying, reciting the rosary, and contemplating the crucifix he kept upon his chest. His confessor reported that he had visions of angels and saints who came to console him. He said he saw Saint Dominic, the founder of the order, who encouraged him to persevere to the end. In one of these visions, he is said to have heard from Christ the words, "Martin, good and faithful servant, your rest is near." After this revelation, his face brightened, and he began to await death with the same joy with which he awaited the Eucharist, calling it the encounter with the beloved. One of the most moving moments of his agony happened when the Viceroy of Peru, the Marquess of Mancera, upon learning of the saint's illness, personally went to visit him. Seeing him, Martin tried to rise from the bed to kiss his hand, but the Viceroy, deeply moved, knelt and kissed his habit, saying, "I am not worthy to stand before a saint." Martin, with a weak voice, replied, "Holiness is to serve. I am only a useless servant of God." This scene, witnessed by the friars, became a symbol of the humility that always accompanied him, even in the face of the admiration and reverence of all who surrounded him. Aware that his hour was drawing near, Martin asked to receive the sacraments with deep devotion. He confessed, received the anointing of the sick, and finally Holy Communion, with tears in his eyes. As he communicated, he repeated softly, "My Lord and my God, do not look upon what I am, but upon what your love has made of me." Then he asked that a small wooden cross be placed in his hands, a symbol of his life of penance and self-offering. He prayed the rosary to the end, and at a certain moment looked at the crucifix and said, "Now, my Jesus, let me go with you." These were his last conscious words, spoken with tenderness and profound peace. On the night of November 3rd, 1639, the convent fell into a sacred silence. The friars gathered around his bed, praying the creed and the psalms. While the choir intoned the words, Subvenite Sancti Dei, come, saints of God, Martin's face became radiant, as if he saw something that others could not see. A gentle fragrance filled the room, and he breathed his last serenely, with a slight smile, like one who falls asleep in the arms of the Lord. Thus ended the earthly life of a man who, having been humiliated by society, was exalted by God, becoming a universal symbol of humility, charity, and holiness. The news of his death spread quickly through Lima and the neighboring regions. Crowds began to gather before the convent, weeping and asking to see the body of the holy brother Martin. Poor people, slaves, Indians and nobles mingled, united by the same admiration and gratitude. Many testified to miracles beside his body. The sick who touched his habit were healed, and an inexplicable fragrance emanated from his incorrupt body. The people said that this aroma was the perfume of sanctity, a sign that God had received him gloriously in heaven. During the wake, the Dominican friars had to allow the people to enter in groups to bid him farewell. Martin's body seemed to sleep, with a serene and luminous countenance. Many knelt and wept in silence, touching his hands and giving thanks for so many favors received. Lima's bells tolled in mourning, and the entire city stopped to honor the one who had been the consolation of the poor and the angel of the sick. His funeral was one of the greatest manifestations of popular faith that Peru has ever witnessed, and even civil authorities declared an official period of mourning in recognition of the good he had done for the nation. The miracles did not cease after his death. In a few days, reports began to arrive of cures, conversions, and graces attributed to his intercession. People who had lost hope began to trust in God again when invoking his name. Devotion to Martin grew rapidly, crossing borders and reaching Europe, where Dominican missionaries spread the news of his virtues and miracles. Many saw in his life proof that holiness does not depend on race, origin, or social position, but on the love with which the gospel is lived. He, the humble mulatto of Lima, had become a beacon of light for the whole church. The death of Saint Martin de Porres was not an end, but a new beginning. His soul, which had been consumed in love and service, now shone in eternity as an example of true holiness. His body was buried in the convent of St. Dominic, the same one where he had lived and served for so many years. Since then, pilgrims from all parts of the world have visited his tomb, bringing flowers, rosaries, and petitions for intercession. And with each prayer, with each miracle, what the whole of Lima already knew was confirmed. Martin de Porres had entered into the glory of the saints as the faithful servant who loved all without distinction and lived to do good. After his death, the memory of Saint Martin de Porres not only remained alive, but grew like a flame that spreads silently and illuminates multitudes. In Lima, the people began to call him the Saint of the Broom, a symbol of the humility with which he served God. His cell was transformed into a place of prayer, and pilgrims came from everywhere to touch the walls, implore his intercession, and give thanks for graces obtained. The convent of St. Dominic, once a space reserved for monastic life, became a sanctuary of popular faith. The Dominicans, seeing the multitude that flocked there daily, understood that the holiness of that brother could no longer remain hidden. It was a light destined to shine throughout the whole world. Soon after the funeral, numerous miracles attributed to his intercession began to be recorded. The sick were cured upon touching his tomb. Sick children recovered after prayers in his name, and families were reconciled when invoking his help. One of the most impressive cases occurred when a blind woman recovered her sight after praying before his sepulchre. Another reported miracle was that of a slave freed from unjust accusations after promising to spread devotion to Brother Martin. These signs reinforced the conviction that God wanted to manifest his glory through that faithful servant whose life had been a pure testimony of the gospel lived to its last consequences. Devotion to Martin de Porres spread quickly throughout the American continent and in a short time reached Europe. In the Dominican convents of Spain, Italy, and Portugal, accounts of his life and heroic virtues began to circulate. Missionaries took his story to the Philippines, Mexico, and Africa, where enslaved peoples found in him an intercessor and model of Christian dignity. Everywhere he was seen as a symbol of unity and fraternity, for his holiness transcended racial and social barriers. The mulatto saint had become the perfect example that the love of Christ knows no distinctions and that all are called to holiness. In 1660, only 21 years after his death, the process of beatification was formally begun. Witnesses were heard, and hundreds of testimonies confirmed the miracles and virtues of the Dominican brother. The ecclesiastical authorities were impressed by the depth of his spiritual life and by the impact of his charity. However, the process was prolonged for centuries due to political complexities and the distance between Peru and Rome. Even so, devotion never weakened. On the contrary, it grew with each generation, sustained by the innumerable accounts of graces received through his intercession. The simple people venerated him as a saint long before the official declaration of the Church. It was Pope Gregory XVI who, in 1837, officially recognized Martin de Porres's heroic virtues and declared him venerable, the first step toward canonization. Almost 2 centuries after his death, his fame for holiness remained unshaken, and his image already adorned churches and chapels in various countries. In 1945, after the confirmation of miracles authenticated by the Holy See, Pope Pius V proceeded to his beatification, granting him the title of Blessed Martin de Porres. The Catholic world celebrated this recognition with joy, and the people of Lima held a great procession of thanksgiving, carrying his relic through the streets, while multitudes sang hymns in his honor. The definitive canonization took place on May 6, 1962, during the pontificate of Pope St. John XXIII, who proclaimed him officially a saint of the Universal Church. In his solemn homily, the Pope emphasized that Martin de Porres was a simple man who, with a broom in his hand, taught the world that true greatness lies in serving. John XXIII, deeply moved, declared that Martin was a reflection of the goodness of Christ, who united heaven and earth through charity. The ceremony was attended by thousands of faithful from various nations, including delegations from Peru, Latin America, and Africa, symbolizing the universality of the message of the new saint. The canonization of Martin de Porres represented a historic milestone for the Church and for humanity. For the first time, a black saint and an illegitimate son was raised to the altars of Rome, breaking barriers that for centuries had separated races and classes. His holiness, born of humility and love, became a powerful testimony to the equality of all before God. Pope John XXIII called him Saint of Universal Fraternity, and since then he has been considered patron of the poor, of nurses, of barbers, of social workers, and of racial justice. His figure is today a symbol of peace, reconciliation, and selfless service. After his canonization, various churches, schools, and hospitals were dedicated in his name throughout the world. In Lima, his tomb became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Latin America, receiving millions of visitors every year. His image, always represented with the broom and a cat, a dog, and a mouse at his feet, symbols of his friendship with all creatures, reminds the faithful that holiness is manifested in small things, and that love, when true, makes no distinctions. Saint Martin de Porres thus became the perennial example of the love that unites heaven and earth by way of humility. The spiritual legacy of Saint Martin transcends borders and centuries. His life is a reminder that the path to God does not require power, wealth, or learning, but a heart that loves and serves. He showed that holiness is not reserved for great theologians or martyrs, but is accessible to all who choose to live the gospel with fidelity. In a world divided by prejudice and inequality, his message resounds with even greater force. We are all brothers, children of the same God, called to live in charity and mercy. The life of Saint Martin de Porres is, therefore, a living gospel, a contemporary parable of Christian love in action. By elevating him to the altars, the Church not only recognized his personal merits, but also proclaimed a universal message of hope. Martin reminds humanity that true greatness lies in serving, and that skin color, origin, or social condition can never be obstacles to divine grace. His life was a lived prophecy, a sign that God chooses the humble to confound the mighty, and thus the Saint of the Broom remains to this day one of the most beloved intercessors of the Church, a model of purity, compassion, and justice for all times. The figure of Saint Martin de Porres transcends the centuries and remains current as a luminous mirror for contemporary humanity. In a world marked by haste, indifference, and divisions, his life reminds us that love is the most revolutionary force that exists. He lived in a time of great social inequalities, where racial prejudice was considered normal, but he responded to all this with the silence of service and the humility of charity. Today, when so many seek recognition, power, and success, Martin points to the opposite way, that of simplicity that offers itself, of the joy that is born of serving. His broom, an instrument of humble work, became a symbol of a holiness accessible to all, which transforms the ordinary into the sacred. The example of St. Martin is a direct appeal to the modern Christian heart. He teaches us that holiness is not distant, nor is it the privilege of a few, but is possible in daily life, in small works of love. The world needs saints like him, people who wash wounds, heal with tenderness, console with words, and serve with joy. He shows us that true apostolate begins when we see Christ in the other, especially in the poor and despised. In a society in which so many feel forgotten, Martin cries out with his life, "God sees you." And it is precisely this certainty, the certainty of being loved by God, that transforms pain into hope and suffering into redemption. In times of racial tensions, inequalities, and exclusions, Saint Martin de Porres is a model of universal fraternity. His life refutes every form of prejudice, showing that before God there are no races, classes, or borders. He was the first mulatto saint of the Americas, but he never claimed human titles. He desired only to love. His message is profoundly evangelical and prophetic. It proclaims that all men are children of the same Father, and that only charity can heal the wounds of division. If the world today is fragmented by ideologies and hatreds, Martin's witness is an invitation to reconciliation and unity through mercy. Martin's spirituality is also an answer to modern indifference and selfishness. While society values having, he reminds us of the value of being. In an era in which suffering is hidden and poverty ignored, he invites us to see in the poor the face of the crucified Christ. Every act of love we perform, his example says, is a seed of eternity. His way of living is a silent yet firm call for each Christian to transform his home, his work, and his relationships into places of service and tenderness. He did not preach with speeches, but with hands that healed and eyes that welcomed, and it is this lived gospel that makes him as powerful today as 4 centuries ago. Martin is also a master of prayer and active contemplation. He reminds us that there is no opposition between praying and acting, between contemplating and serving. The secret of his strength was constant union with God. Before touching the poor, he touched the heart of Christ in the Eucharist. In the time when many feel exhausted and empty, his life teaches that true rest is in God. Martin worked much, but he never strayed from prayer, and it is precisely this union between altar and service that turned him into a channel of grace. He shows us that holiness is not achieved by great deeds, but by faithfulness to small daily duties performed with love. The message of St. Martin also speaks to the hearts of those who suffer discrimination, rejection, or humiliation. He lived in his own flesh the scorn of men, but he never allowed hatred to penetrate his soul. He transformed every offense into prayer, every injustice into sacrifice, and every humiliation into an opportunity to love more. The strength of his holiness came precisely from the patient acceptance of the crosses that God allowed him to carry. In a time when many seek to repay evil with evil, Martin shows the power of meekness. His life is living proof that forgiveness is stronger than vengeance, and that humility is the path of true victory. The Saint of the Broom is also a model of spiritual ecology, a forerunner of respect for creation. He saw in each creature a reflection of divine goodness, treated animals with tenderness, and cared for nature with reverence. For him, everything God created deserved love and care. This contemplative gaze upon the created world is an urgent lesson for our days, in which man destroys the environment and forgets that he is guardian, not owner, of creation. Martin, with his pure heart, teaches us to rediscover the charm of the simple, the value of silence, and the beauty of caring for life in all its forms. In the Church, St. Martin de Porres continues to be a symbol of selfless service and universal love. His devotion is especially alive in Latin America, where he is invoked as patron of social justice and intercessor of the humble. In poor communities, his example inspires volunteers, nurses, and religious who dedicate their lives to caring for those most in need. He is, in essence, the saint of concrete charity, the kind that does not wait for applause, but acts moved solely by the love of Christ. In every hospital, shelter, or mission where pain is alleviated, the spirit of Martin de Porres seems to be reborn. More than a saint of the past, Martin is a saint of the future. His message points to what the world needs to rediscover: the centrality of love, the dignity of service, and the beauty of humility. He did not found schools, nor did he write treatises, but he left a more precious inheritance, the witness of a life that transformed earth into a reflection of heaven. Every Christian who imitates him, even in small actions, participates in this silent work of redemption. He reminds us that there is no greater vocation than to love, and that God writes eternity through the simplest gestures of his faithful children. Today, more than 4 centuries after his death, St. Martin de Porres continues to inspire millions of people. In every church where his image is present, in every prayer that bears his name, the message he lived to perfection echoes: that charity is the light of the world and humility is the throne of God. Before his life, the gospel gains new brightness, for he proved that love, when pure, overcomes all prejudice and crosses all borders. St. Martin de Porres, the faithful and joyful servant, the saint of the broom and of charity, is today and always a call to the conversion of the heart, an invitation to love without measure, to serve without distinction, and to live solely for God.